We have David here, and we're going to be talking about the hedonistic imperative, wireheading, and where these terms came from, and the often poorly understood uh, version of the hedonistic imperative. I think some people often conflate or distill the hedonistic imperative to mean wireheading. What do you?
Yes, I mean, clearly, if one does argue that we're going to phase out the biology of suffering and live lives of perpetual bliss, then it's very natural to assimilate this to something like wireheading. But for all sorts of reasons, I don't think wireheading, i.e., intracranial self-stimulation of the reward centers and its pharmacological equivalent, is a plausible scenario for our future. Not least, there will presumably always be selection pressure against wireheading. Wireheads do not want to have baby wireheads and raise wirehead children. I think a much more credible scenario is the idea that we're going to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill and allow ourselves and our future children to enjoy lives based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And one of the advantages of recalibration rather than straightforward hedonic maximization is that by urging recalibration, one isn't telling people that they ought to be giving up their existing preferences or values. Is that if your hedonic set point, i.e. your average state of well-being, is much higher than it is now, your quality of life will clearly be much higher, but it doesn't involve any sacrifice of the values you hold most dear. That's a rather simplistic way of putting it. Clearly, where one lies basically on the hedonic axis will impose various cognitive biases. Someone who is, let's say, depressive or prone to low mood, at least, will have a very different set of biases from someone who is naturally cheerful. But nonetheless, it doesn't entail, as long as we aim for a motivational architecture of gradients of bliss, that doesn't entail giving up anything you want to hold on to. I think that's really important, because a lot of people will be worried that somehow that if yes, we do enter into some kind of secular paradise, this will involve giving up their normal relationships, their ordinary values, and what they hold most dear. Recalibration doesn't entail this.
That's interesting. People think that, as soon as you switch on the hedonistic imperative, that means you're destined for a very narrow set of values. It could be just one peak experience being replayed over and over again in some narrow local maximum.
Yes, I suppose one thinks of kind of crazed wirehead rats. In fairness, I mean, if one does imagine orgasmic bliss, most people don't complain that their orgasms are too long. I'm not convinced there's anything desperately immoral about orgasmic bliss that lasts weeks, months, years, or even centuries. But one needs to examine the wider sociological picture and asks, is it really sustainable for us to become blissed out as distinct from blissful?
Right, and by blissed out you mean something like the lotus eaters found in the Odysseus writings.
Yes, I mean, clearly it is one version of paradise and bliss, a kind of meditative tranquility, not doing anything. But there are other versions of bliss in which one is hyper-motivated. It seems that, crudely speaking, motivation, which is mediated by the mesolimbic dopamine system, and raw bliss, which is associated with opioid activation of our twin hedonic hotspots. These axes are orthogonal. Now, they're very closely interrelated thanks to natural selection, but in principle, we can amplify one or damp down the other. Empirically, at any rate, it seems to be the case today that the happiest people are also the most motivated. They have the greatest desires. This runs counter to the old Buddhist notion that desire is suffering. If you actually look at people who are depressive or chronically depressed, quite frequently they have an absence of desire or motivation. But the point is, we should be free to choose. Yes, it is potentially hugely liberatory, this control over our reward architecture, our pleasure circuitry that biotechnology offers. But let's get things right. We don't want to mess things up and produce the equivalent of large numbers of people on heroin. And this is why I so strenuously urge the case for recalibration in the long run genetically, in the shorter run perhaps via various non-recreational drugs.
Okay. Well, people may be sort of worried that recalibrating someone is akin to disrupting the continuum of self, or this enduring metaphysical ego. So the person at the other end wouldn't be really a continuation of the person at the beginning. What do you think? How would you respond to that sort of criticism?
It depends how strict one's conception of personal identity is. Now, would you be worried if you were to learn tomorrow that you had won the national lottery, for example? As I transform your lifestyle, your circle of friends, would this trigger the anxiety that the person who was living the existence of a multimillionaire wasn't really you? Well, perhaps you should be worried this, but on the whole, most people would be relatively relaxed at the prospect. I would see this more as akin to a small child growing up. Yes, in one sense, as one becomes a mature adult, one has killed the toddler or lost the essence of what it was to be a toddler or whatnot, but only in a very benign sense. And by aiming for recalibration and hedonic enrichment rather than maximization, there's much less of a risk of losing anything that you think is really valuable or important.
Okay, well that's interesting. Well, talking about value, in order to not lose forms of value, even if you don't use it much, you might have some values that you just leave up in the attic to gather dust, like toys that you don't play with anymore, that you might want to get up, pick up once in 1,000 years or whatnot. How do you then preserve complexity of value while also achieving high hedonic states? Do you think they go hand in hand, or do you think preserving complexity of value reduces the likelihood that you'll be able to achieve optimal hedonic states?
As an empirical matter, and I stress empirical here, it seems to be the case that the happiest people are responsive to the broadest possible range of rewarding stimuli. It tends to be depressives who get stuck in a rut. And so, other things being equal, by recalibrating ourselves, becoming happy and then super happy, we can potentially, at any rate, enrich the complexity of our lives, the range of rewarding stimuli. It makes getting stuck in a rut less likely, both for the individual and for civilization as a whole. I think one of the reasons we're afraid of some kind of loss of complexity, is that the idea of heaven, including traditional Christian heaven, it can sound a bit monotonous. And for happy people, at least, one of the experiences they find most unpleasant is boredom. But essentially, it should be a matter of choice. Yes, someone who is very happy to, let's say, listen to a piece of music or contemplate beautiful scenery or art should be free to do so and not forced into leading a very kind of complex or complicated life. But equally, folk who want to do a diverse range of things, well, that's feasible too.
Hmm. So, do you think that, well, if I were to say to you, I think that, well, actually, I do. I think that it's possible, at least in the long run, for civilizations that aim for higher and higher complexity of values can encode other small, narrow bandwidth values if people want to use those individuals. But if the society maintains an increase in complexity of value, it'll also be opening itself up to having higher enriching states that can be achieved just because of the amount the space of patterns that can be achieved with more complexity,
Yes, I
if you know what I mean.
this touches on another theme close to my heart, which is the nature of psychedelia and altered states of consciousness. That one of the advantages of gaining mastery of our reward circuitry is that we will be able to explore an unparalleled diversity of altered state spaces of consciousness that are currently inaccessible and today, frankly, in many cases, are too dangerous for the Darwinian mind to explore. Once again, this is optional. I'm not suggesting anyone should have any obligation to do so, but nonetheless, if you want to understand the range of subjective properties of matter and energy, then I think you will need to explore this immense diversity of state spaces of consciousness, and it in future will be possible to do so safely with our reward motivational architecture enhanced.
Oh, that's interesting. But what that's talking about an individual exploring the state space of possible experience. Societal structure to allow individuals to explore, I guess, new realms, new state spaces of bliss or consciousness, that would have to also be very complex, I'd imagine. Do you think is there a trade-off between complexity of value to achieving a stable and flourishing society?
Ooh, a difficult question. I mean, I suppose one needs to clarify what one means by the complexity of value. There is one sense in which I would argue that value and disvalue is universal. The pleasure pain axis seems to be a universal of nature. I would argue that it discloses the world's inbuilt metric of value and disvalue, but within this framework, we can form an immense range of different specific values. Language, in particular, enables us to value and disvalue an immense range of ideas, concepts, and states of affairs that would not be possible for a non-human animal that does not have a rich generative syntax to value. So there's, yeah, as I said, two senses to distinguish there.
I guess, like metaphorically, if you had a fun park with just, you know, one seesaw that was an excellent seesaw, mind you, and all your resources were poured into optimizing that seesaw, so it would just get, the most best seesaw there is. Okay, instead of but you'd get diminishing returns the more money you put in, or the more sort of optimization power you spent on trying to develop this seesaw. Instead, you could distribute your effort or your optimization power across many different fun park sort of activities, including water slides, trampolines, flying foxes, and whatnot. So Would you opt for the one seesaw, which was the best seesaw possible in this universe, or would you opt for a range of fun park activities?
Uh, Candidly, I would probably opt for the best possible seesaw. But I can quite understand that someone who is, shall we say, more psychologically robust, different temperament, would opt for the entire adventure playground. Um, I think it's really important to stress this, that transhumanists are not trying to tell anyone how to live their lives. That by to use another example, by urging radical life extension, it's not the job of a transhumanist to tell anyone what they should be doing in their radically longer life. It is an enabling mechanism, and likewise by phasing out the biology of involuntary suffering, by sort of recalibrating the hedonic treadmill gradients of bliss, I think one should avoid the temptation, and I said it's difficult to avoid, to try and specify what people should be doing with their time, how they should be living their lives. In a sense, it's not our job to do that. It's the liberatory potential of this technology that should be stressed, I think.
Well, it's great to have as much liberty as possible, but sometimes people get tempted to uh, go overboard with liberty. Let's just say you were governor of this playground that was under construction, and you were trying to cater for all the possible people who would want to explore it. This is of course, a wildly far future playground where lots is possible, and also leaving room for future developments. The more we understand about how the universe works, and the more we progress as a civilization, become more intelligent in that. Would you still only develop one seesaw for everybody to use, or would you develop a range of fun park activities such that people would be able to experience a myriad of experiences that were safe?
Well, first, I like your metaphor as this kind of cosmic playground. Let's assume that we have phased out the biology of suffering. We have discharged all our ethical responsibilities. Let's assume that there's no Darwinian life elsewhere to rescue within our forward light cone or anything. So, in a sense, now we are free to choose how are we going to live our lives. Yes, if I were a notional governor, I would probably want to provide a diversity of amusements. But just one point here. We are social primates, and so many of our desires and preferences implicate each other, other sentient beings. And I think if one is to have true freedom, the ability to do whatever one wants, to experience whatever one wants, this can probably only be done in immersive reality. That in what we normally would think of as basement reality, there have to be all kinds of constraints, restrictions on personal freedom and liberty. And of course, this doesn't sit very comfortably, but nonetheless, I see this as going to be necessary indefinitely. If you want complete freedom to do whatever you want, it'll have to be in immersive VR. It can't be in a world in which your choices are impacting on other sentient beings.
Right. Okay. So, in a sense, you'd have to live in some form of solipsistic world where all of the consequences of your actions would not interact with any other sentient beings. Do you think that's the end point?
I was making this point for, because of this term, kind of freedom and liberty. To have complete and absolute freedom in that sense is impossible without violating the interests of others. And sure, Robinson Crusoe or his technological successor can have complete unbridled freedom to live the kind of life he wants, but insofar as yes, we are social primates or intend to remain social beings, there will have to be constraints on what we can or can't do. This is a problem with preference utilitarianism and its variants, that so many of our preferences as social primates do violate or conflict with the interests and preferences of others.
That's interesting. You've also mentioned before that about the utilitarian shockwave, and that straightforward utilitarianism necessitates a utilitarian utilitarian shockwave. But negative utilitarianism doesn't. By classical utilitarianism, do you mean hedonistic utilitarianism?
Yes, classical utilitarianism in the Benthamite sense, rather than this sense of maximizing preferences. Yeah, if you tell people that you're a negative utilitarian, you want to phase out the biology of suffering, they'll sometimes say, what doesn't that mean that you would press a button to destroy the world, which is sometimes treated as a reductio ad absurdum. But it's only relatively recently it's been recognized that classical utilitarianism, not negative utilitarianism, has these apocalyptic implications in an era of technology, in that if one is a classical utilitarian, one is seemingly obliged to work for a world that is, so to speak, tiled with utilitarianism. Every conceivable bit of matter and energy optimized for pure bliss. And this would essentially involve dismantling the whole civilization and intelligent life. By contrast, if one is a negative utilitarian, yes, one is obliged to phase out the biology of suffering, but then it is entirely optional, ethically speaking, what kind of society or civilization one builds. So yes, personally, I advocate life based on gradients of intelligent bliss with a hedonic set point that can be set arbitrarily close to hedonic maximum. But it's unclear whether a strict classical utilitarian is allowed to hold this position.
That's interesting. Is there any places on the web that you can point me to and others that talk about the endpoint or the endpoint sort of end game scenarios of various forms of utilitarianism, like classical versus preference versus negative?
There is surprisingly little scholarly literature on endpoints. As I said, the negative utilitarianism is generally regarded as extremely marginal. Smart's reply to Popper on the theme of negative utilitarianism, i.e. that it would mandate painlessly destroying the world, is often regarded as a reductio ad absurdum. There isn't a single scholarly article, to my knowledge, that considers the implications of a classical utilitarian ethic for the endpoint of civilization. I mean, perhaps intuitively one thinks, well, utilitarian, a utilitarian shockwave, that's technologically speaking a long way away. But if one is a utilitarian, then any form of temporal discounting indistinguishable from zero is ethically impermissible, i.e. one is apparently obliged to be spending all one's life, dedicating one's life, or most of it anyway, to promoting this utilitarian shockwave. Preference utilitarianism, even though I profoundly disagree with some of their ideas, I regard that perhaps the highest quality blog on the net is the Less Wrong community, and many, though not all, Less Wrongers are preference utilitarians. Very hot on the complexity of value, and Eddie Yukowski, for instance, mispronouncing his name, apologies, Eddie's here again, would actually regard a utilitarian shockwave scenario as barely any better than a cosmos tiled with paper clips. Just one qualification here. It isn't absolutely clear that utilitarian must be matter and energy optimized for bliss at a very, very simple level. It's possible that we should, if one is a strict classical utilitarian, be aiming for kind of Jupiter pleasure centers or something like this. But the assumption is that utilitarianism is extremely homogeneous in the same way that orgasmic bliss is pretty homogeneous.
Yeah, so whatever the utility is, whether it's paper clips, smiley faces, or blobs of orgasm, yes, that's right. That would be the whatever is being optimized for. It's a narrow bandwidth of value, right? Is being optimized.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yes.
So another point, it could be that if you optimize for that, based on your ability to make projections today, you could end up in a rather limited local narrow maximum. If you reduce your complexity of value so as to optimize so to use all the optimization power on paper clips, then you may find that the value you cannot escape from that particular value set, because the complexity of intelligence or value needed to get some form of like a value escape velocity away from like the endpoint of utilitarian shockwave is just too weak at that stage. The gravity of utilitarian will always pull you back to this utilitarian state, yeah, or this narrow
It's an
bandwidth of.
if, and it's a very big if, that the pleasure plane axis does disclose the world's intrinsic metric of value, and that's a very controversial thing. If it is the case, then this might argue in favor of some form of convergence hypothesis, that whenever intelligent, sentient beings in the cosmos evolve with the capacity to rewrite their own genetic source code, they will eventually tend to redesign themselves, first of all perhaps to live life based on gradients of bliss, but ultimately if they're utilitarians, some form of utilitarian shockwave. Once again, that is speculation. It's not a prediction. It's a conjecture, and opposed to this convergence hypothesis is the kind of the orthogonality thesis. Yeah.
So wouldn't we be seeing like paper clips or smiley faces everywhere we looked if that was the case?
Yeah, this is the Fermi paradox. My own take on that would be that intelligent, sentient life does exist elsewhere, but not within our cosmological horizon. That once again, there's this principle of mediocrity. What percentage of Hubble volumes in which life, information-bearing self-replicators arises, does this event actually happen more than once? We don't yet understand the process by which information-bearing self-replicators arose on Earth. Every single mechanism that I've read about seems at some stage or other to have some thermodynamically improbable aspect. So yes, it may well be the case that we are alone as dictated by the principle of mediocrity, but we don't know enough yet to say this.
That's true.
But yeah,
I've thought that if there were like more than one civilization optimizing their existence in the universe in different ways, the survivability of a civilization which converged on some form of utilitarian shockwave would be kind of brittle if and inflexible in its defense against another civilization which had a greater a more complex value system to propagate throughout the universe. Stopping a shockwave of utilitarianism in the form of smiley faces or paperclips could be relatively trivial for a civilization that had optimized its focus on developing, resiliency. And being able to sort of defend itself against other empires or other kinds of shockwaves, right?
Yes, yes, yeah. No, I mean, one question, and in one sense, this might seem a messy compromise, but we would presumably have the technological ability, if we decide that the rest of the universe within our cosmological horizon is sterile, to, in a sense, propagate a utilitarian shockwave so that elsewhere, but preserve our own little bubble of complexity. Once again, that would be a rather messy compromise, but given the size of the accessible cosmos, you would be coming pretty close to maximum empirical value there. I mean, that would be one compromise.
Well, that's interesting. So there's this article that talked about a loss of complexity of value in a sense. The idea that this sex chip that was sort of described on IO9, why a sex chip could be considerably more trouble than it's worth, argues that people will, if these sex chips are available, these orgasmatrons, they'll just make people just continuously press the orgasm button over and over again, much like some of the mice in experiments that, if they press a button, they get more oxytocin or adrenaline or something like that pumped into their system, and people wouldn't work, and they'd get unhealthy and start demanding access to more more of these chips or whatnot. So yeah, do you see that as a possible near-term threat to humanity?
Well, as I said, selection pressure means that the people who go on to propagate their genes won't be the ones who are pressing their sex chips all day. Possibly I'm more relaxed about the possibility of at least a large section of the population doing the functional equivalent than the author of the article in question. After all, so many people spend their lives sexually frustrated. This seems, in some ways, a much more civilized approach to giving people sexual pleasure. I mean, whether it's people who have it's a socially taboo sexual orientation, or simply a high libido that can never be satisfied. This would seem, a way that doesn't have the unacceptable ethical implications that satisfying their libido does in today's world.
So even if it wasn't about sort of satisfying like a Darwinian urge, it was just a pleasure chip. Do you believe that people should these sorts of things be regulated? If they can turn people into sort of quivering bulbs of jelly that don't nourish themselves and sit around being non-productive all day.
If that were the outcome, yes, I do. In the same way that, at least in some limited way, drugs like heroin probably need to be regulated, and that's why I do urge gradients of intelligent bliss. But I don't think we should be prudish about this. I mean, and after all, this fetish, for want of a better word, we have about complexity. In many spheres, let's say in mathematics, for example, one looks for the simplest, cleanest, most elegant proof. Why not the same in the realm of value and pleasure? What the English call Heath Robinson machines, and I believe the Americans Rube Goldberg devices, are these ridiculously complicated devices for doing incredibly trivial things. And in some ways, our lives resemble Rube Goldberg or Heath Robinson machines. We are incredibly irrational in our approach to subjective well-being. And though I don't urge wireheading or sex chips, I do urge a much, much more rational approach to pleasure, well-being, that I think we should precision engineer our reward circuitry, and dare I say it, even our relationships to ensure lifelong well-being.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. It's how to do it. That's a real question. We just don't know. And if you keep on talking about like preserving some form of, or our biological descendants, it may not be possible with just an iteration of our Darwinistic evolved biology to be able to achieve what you're talking about. It may be very problematic. It may be better to become more like a cyborg, or replace each atom, each cell with a nanobot, like over time, and then slowly evolve into utility fog, and then we can go about the task of optimizing our reward pathways, and being precision engineering our happiness and our relationships.
Yes, I mean there is a real tension, between seeking eternal youth, or at least indefinitely extended youth, and preserving our identity in that sense, and wanting to become post-human and optimize matter and energy in ever more subjectively glorious ways. And I don't know how this tension will be ultimately resolved. I would find it hard to imagine that any advanced post-human superintelligence would regard it as ethical deliberately to create brain-damaged, dysfunctional, malaise-ridden, human-like creatures. The question is, do we want to preserve our identities in our current form, or do we, both as individuals and as a civilization as a whole, to grow up?
Grow up, yeah, but when you say grow up, it's hard to know where to grow to. I mean, if we met a civilization that had been there and done that, it'd help a lot, wouldn't it? I mean, especially if they were friendly.
Indeed, it is. I mean, so we come back to values again. If you think, as I do, that our overriding ethical obligation is to minimize and then phase out altogether involuntary suffering, then after that, the world or the universe is our oyster, so to speak. But if your values are much more complex than that, then our ethical obligations are much more extensive, and it's much more technically challenging to realize them.
That's true, and that's a trade-off. You may be able to achieve more resilience, and perhaps a wider space of possible designer mind spaces with a wider complexity of value, but it may be easier to achieve a more narrow complexity of value very quickly. But yeah, it's kind of like single-celled organisms are often very resilient in a sense, aren't they? Like I guess when you look at like the environments in which they can inhabit. Yeah, like in the middle of lava and stuff. It's it's difficult to know. I think there's some value in learning what to value, and always being ready to update your values, your beliefs about what we should value based on new evidence and based on new experience. And that's why I say, even if we start off with a value now, if you have a value system that you think is the best, and then suddenly you met an alien civilization who were doing very fine, thank you, with a completely different value system, what argument, if any, would you give this alien civilization to adopt your value system?
Oh, good heavens. See, I tend to assume that any alien civilization that we encountered, and I said my best guess is we won't, but let's assume I'm wrong, is that essentially they would be vastly more sophisticated than we are. That either they will, in a sense, be at the stage where they haven't mastered their own genetic code, can't redesign themselves, i.e., they're still infrahuman, or alternatively, they have long since transcended that stage. So yes, what is the nature of this advanced civilization? It's probably unimaginable. The nearest I come to a prediction is that we are not going to supersede the pleasure-pain axis, or rather, we might transform ourselves to occupy simply one extreme end of it. I mean, possibly even our peak experiences will be much lower than their lowest dips. But if there is no hedonic tone to experience, if it's not subjectively, self-intimatingly valuable or disvaluable, it's unclear in what sense anything would matter. I mean, some people, for example, have urged that consciousness is inessential to intelligence, and it may be the case that non-biological machines evolve, recursively self-improving, and become super intelligent without there being conscious or sentient. Indeed, perhaps they would have a radically different axis of value in which their supreme value is maximizing paper clips. Now, for all sorts of reasons, I think this is unlikely, but this would involve getting into some quite speculative realms about the nature of consciousness.
Interesting. So, yeah, okay, but I think we've talked about the nature of consciousness in another video, and it would be awesome to talk about again. I like the subject, but on this dual sort of point, do you see as pain on the same sliding scale as pleasure, or are they completely different sliding scales?
In one sense, pain or any experience below hedonic zero is radically unlike the kingdom of pleasure and well-being, and yet nonetheless one wants to say that they have something in common, and I'm not convinced it's possible to define what this is. It's a primitive term. Someone who has no capacity for pleasure or for pain, I don't think that they can really understand the nature of the experience except by undergoing it itself. That, for example, agony has this self-intimatingly disvaluable quality that I can't unpack it any further. Which doesn't mean to say that in some sense it's unscientific. I mean, redness, phenomenal redness, for example. No, one can't define it in terms of something more primitive, but it's not meaningless or unscientific. And yes, we don't know why the pleasure-pain axis exists at all, or why it has the properties it does. Uniquely, there seems to be some kind of, this is controversial, some proto-functionality built into the very nature of the pleasure-pain axis itself. In the case of pain or agony, kind of avoidance. In the case of pleasure, this kind of pro attitude.
It's interesting, well, you talk about the pleasure, the hedonic zero as being the point at which there's no pain and no pleasure. Anything above zero, there's only pleasure, but in different gradients, like a like a volume. And anything below zero, there's only pain. But what if it's more like a grayscale sort of graph where you've got grey in the middle, like a completely equal amount of white and black in the middle, and then going up from that, you've got diminishing amounts of black and increasing amounts of white. Is that a metaphor that you think is appropriate or doesn't fit?
Yes, it's a suggestive metaphor because one big complication is that we undergo composite states. Yes, there are states of unmitigated nastiness and unbridled joy, but we also have states, let's say, of sweet nostalgia, or masochists, for instance, for whom physically painful stimuli trigger the release of endogenous opioids. If right now you were to learn that, yes, you could have $1 million if you could plunge your hand into iced cold water for 5 minutes, yeah, doing so in a sense, you would be in pain, and yet at the same time you're doing it because, yes, you're anticipating this happy outcome that was in prospect. So, yeah, composite states make things much more complicated. But ultimately, I think it's a complication and no more, that there really is some a scale, a binary scale, if you like, better and worse, with a very natural dividing point, Sidgwick's hedonic zero, that marks out states that are hedonically neutral or have no hedonic tone at all.
Yeah, right. So, but you're not saying that the same amounts of pleasure and pain cancel each other out. You're saying that they're completely different experiences that inhabit two different sides of this scale.
Yes, it is very difficult to actually understand and appreciate the nature of bliss if one is a state of agony or despair, and conversely, at the other end of the scale, if one is a strict classical utilitarian, then all sorts of trade-offs are not just morally disturbing trade-offs are not just permissible, but mandatory. I mean, this is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of classical utilitarianism. If a genie were to offer me the chance of exponentially increasing misery for you, but super exponentially increasing bliss for me, then I am apparently morally obligated to accept the genie's offer, and as you get ever more miserable, I become super exponentially happier and can presumably congratulate myself on having made the moral choice. Classical utilitarianism has some profoundly unintuitive ethical consequences that undercut the charge that negative utilitarianism is too counterintuitive to take seriously.
Yeah, I read a conversation you had with someone about that. So the same goes for a utility monster. In a sense, you'd be like the utility monster, because if you were to accept a utility for yourself that was equal or greater than the disutility of somebody else put out of place as a result of you doing so, you would be obliged to do so.
Yes, this was a conversation I had with Toby Ord, who wrote a paper, Why I'm Not a Negative Utilitarian. I think the autobiographical element is very apt there, because Toby is a very naturally happy person, and he describes negative utilitarianism as I think the words were a devastatingly callous doctrine. This idea that one would press the button to erase all civilization, however wonderful it was, if it would prevent the slightest distress. But for reasons we touched on earlier in this interview, it seems to be classical utilitarianism that mandates this apocalyptic consequence in the form of a utilitarian shockwave. I mean, one can trade intuitions all day. This is it. Have we any reason to expect the ultimate ethical theory will be comfortable with, will conform to our current intuitions any more than we expect the picture of physics, quantum field theory, and whatnot, to coincide with the everyday intuitions we formed on the African savannah?
Ah, yes, good, very good point. Yeah. So, we were talking before, but like it didn't get on video. Where did the term wireheading come from? What's the history of it? Why did it come about?
Um, I may need to be corrected here, but I think Larry Niven in Wirehead came up with the term. The discovery of what were then called, what were called for many years, the pleasure centres, dates to the discovery of Olds and Milner in 1954. They had discovered that there were parts of the brain that rats would self-stimulate, and they would self-stimulate to the point of exhaustion in preference to food, or sex, or anything else. That uniquely, it seems that wireheading does not show physiological tolerance. It's just as enjoyable and rewarding after 10 hours as it is after 10 minutes. And I think it's a very important clue, even though I don't think the future does lie in wireheading. It shows that there is nothing inevitable about tolerance. I mentioned that they're no longer called the pleasure centres. This is because it seems that the particular hedonic hotspots involved aren't mediating pure bliss, that they're mediating pure desire, this kind of frenzy of anticipation that a starved rat who hasn't eaten for 10 days will not cross an electrified grid for food, but will cross an electrified grid to get the chance to self-stimulate. I mean, perhaps imagine that you're about to go to bed with Miss Universe, or you're about to have something inconceivably wonderful. It's desire and anticipation that these particular reward centers are activating rather than pure bliss. Pure bliss appears to be mediated, as we touched on earlier, by activation by full mu agonists of twin hedonic hotspots. They're about a cubic millimeter in size in rats, scaled up to humans about a cubic centimeter each in volume.
Well, it would be good if we can grow those centers, maybe. Yeah, so anyway, I think that's all. Except I did have one nagging question. I don't know if it can be well formed or whether it's relevant. Let's just say we do find a way that we can somehow, like, bend time, or we can sort of jump in and out of like a time as we know it in this particular bubble of the universe. And do you think that'll affect value? Do you think that'll affect like well, obviously our anticipation? If we know we can like achieve something, will there be any use for anticipation? If we can see the future so accurately and change the past, maybe. Yeah, forget about changing the past. Yeah.
Changing the past would be technically rather more ambitious. In the case of time, one of the things that neuroscience offers the prospect of is shaping our sense of temporal passage, that under the influence of various psychedelic drugs, the passage of a few seconds can apparently seem like centuries. And one route to radically increase subjective lifespans is to subjectively mess with our sense of temporal passage. Of course, one could now go into realms of speculative physics and what would happen if, for example, we could position ourselves in the orbit of a black hole and a gravitational well and observe the history of the rest of the universe pass by in front of our eyes or something like that. But that's extremely speculative.
Yeah, still, it would be interesting to watch, but like to interact with would be quite difficult, I imagine. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, that's been awesome. Is there any concluding points you want to sum up with?
No. It's once again, it's something I lay stress on, that I think our overriding obligation is to phase out involuntary suffering. That yes, we can turn the cosmos into one gigantic adventure playground, and have incredible fun, wonderful, sublime lives, and yet right now we have a moral obligation to phase out suffering in all sentient beings. And yes, that's what I think we should focus on now.
Excellent. Well, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the Rational Future. So yeah, thanks everybody for tuning
I
in.
was wondering if...
Yep.
No, Adam, I was just wondering if we should do the last one again. I wasn't quite prepared for my take. Do you think that was... Well, I don't know.
That was fine. Yeah,
Okay,
do it
right.
again. If there's anything else you want to add, now's the time.
I was just searching in vain for some witty saying or aphorism or something like that. And
That's
failed.
all. Yeah, that was fine.
No, basically, I've learned to very much trust your judgment as to what works and what doesn't. So it's
Yeah. Oh,
but
look,
yeah, edit
these
a way to
Skype
get some
recordings
good.
are like, they're not like, Hollywood quality. They're pixelated, the noise is crackly, and people don't expect there to be, perfected scripts or like anything ridiculously polished. At least I hope not, anyway. Um, but on the other hand, if you're not satisfied or you want me to sort of cut out the last bit, I can very easily do that.
Oh, let's just ask. Let me just think what I'm going to say first. Let me just
Well, how about this?
form.
I'll just